it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off front pages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 17 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I am an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Okay, so we are going to actually cover 4 topics again. So we'll cover the midweek video as well. That was never intentional to put this as part of this unscripted, but we will do it again for, I think, the 3rd or 4th week in a row. So papers this week, Orban takes the bully pulpit. Orban takes the bully pulpit. Fears over Russian space base indiscriminate weapons. Macron criticizes U.S. and Germany ahead of NATO summit over Ukraine membership. And finally, the West Philippine Sea newsletter, volume 8. So we will go starting with Viktor Orban. He is the Prime Minister of Hungary. He is also the President of the European Union. They have a rotating 6-month presidency. And he is it for the next 6 months, to the cringe of most of the European Union. So he has taken that decision and is, for background, Hungary has maintained good relations with Russia and somewhat good relations with Ukraine. It has been a vocal critic of the NATO policy regarding the Ukraine war. Mainly, again, his relatively friendly position with the Russians. So that has been a sticking point with the EU and NATO, is that he's still considered friendly to Russia. This week, Viktor Orban, it would be last week, he actually took the days within taking the presidency. He visited both Kyiv and Moscow to meet with both presidents, with the goal of fomenting some form of peace or at least a ceasefire. So, kind of background of history, as we all know, the Russian offensive in eastern southern Ukraine has been slow and relentless with no rapid advances. That was relatively expected. I know there was a lot of hay to be made of what was called rapid advances into Kharkiv by the Russians. Those was probably more of a straightening line, maybe threaten the Kharkiv a little bit more, but mainly to push the Ukrainians further away from the Russian border, because attacks have been able to be launched into Russia by Ukraine special forces special forces have a relatively close position from Kharkiv to the Russian border across to Belgorod. So the West has been also, to talk about the Russian offensive, Ukraine is on a strategic defensive this year, or is expected to be this year, mainly something that's been pushed by his Western allies, that basically Ukraine doesn't have enough manpower to assume an offensive this year, especially after the losses taken last year during their spring and summer offensives. So the West is concerned, that's just what I talked briefly, the West is concerned about the ability of the Ukrainians to endure a war of attrition, which appears to be the Russian strategy. Now, there's trade-offs for the Russian side, but demographically, Ukraine is, I've talked about this several times, Ukraine is demographically challenged against the Russians. The Russians have just over 3.5 times as much population and a much larger GDP, something like 14 times larger. Now, there's certain aspects as Ukraine is from a European perspective, it's a decent-sized country. Actually, it would be probably considered on the large side as far as European countries go. but it doesn't have the massiveness of Russia. So Russia has to have a larger GDP just to maintain that larger country. So the GDP is less a concern, except it's the ability of the Russians to be able to allocate all those resources that make its GDP possible and focus it on the Ukraine war at the expense of future, whether deficit spending or selling its future. But the point is the GDP is much larger in Russia, but it's a little bit deceiving. It's probably better to look at purchase parity to get an idea of how much richer one country is over the other. Russia is still a richer country, but it's not quite as bad as a 14-1 would seem to show, except for it gives the Russians a lot of flexibility on how to create a war economy. The West is also able to compensate for a lot of the Ukrainian shortness in their financial position, their GDP position, by giving them loans and grants to help them maintain their government and maintain their society outside of military spending. So that is something that's the economics of it is less important. It's the demographics. It's the people. The Ukraine doesn't have the people. I've talked about this in several papers before. If you compare the average Ukrainian soldier versus the average Russian soldier, the Ukrainians are much more lethal when you look at casualties created. Part of this is also by the Russians tend to be on the offensive more often, which does create more casualties than being on the defensive. But generally, it looks at just with all the Western weapons the Ukrainians have received, they are generally more lethal. Probably part of it is they also tend to be a little bit more motivated than the Russians because the Ukrainians are defending their homeland. But the lethality factor of the average Ukrainian, the advantage of lethality factor of the average Ukrainian soldier does not exceed the 3.5 to 1 advantage that the Russians have. So the Ukrainians, this is a problem for the Ukrainians, and all the aid in the world cannot completely, it can help, but not completely overcome this disadvantage. The other part of the Ukraine war is that the Ukrainians just can't up and leave from a battlefield, go train in a NATO country, and then bring these units back in ready to fight. They need the manpower. They don't have the luxury of sending troops off to train in NATO countries for, even if the NATO countries agree to it, they can't spend the better part of a year training like that, similar to what you've seen with the F-16 pilots. So peace talks have really been stalled. The last significant peace talk was the failed Swiss peace talks. Before that, China has came up with their 6-point peace strategy. Before that, you had Turkey trying to revive their 2022 peace formula, which is probably the most serious peace formula that somebody can adopt, because generally both sides have been open to it as at least a roadmap to have serious negotiations. So, but right now, peace talks are stalled. Both sides do talk about peace. You got the Ukrainians talking about with their Swiss peace plan, where they didn't invite the Russians, so it did not seem like a serious effort. They struggled because of that criticism of not inviting the Russians to get real international support. The Russians have been, they have not been particularly helpful in trying to promote peace. They've been rather lukewarm to the Chinese plan. Absolutely rejected the Swiss Ukrainian plan, which I think is probably justified because it wasn't really a peace roadmap. It was more of either a wish list or a dictation to the Russians. And the Russians, their response was the only way that they would even talk about peace is if the Ukrainians surrendered the 4 countries that Russia has illegally annexed in eastern Ukraine. If the Ukrainians give that up, leave those areas and cede them to the Russians along with Crimea, That's basically a surrender notification to the Ukrainians. Basically, give up 25% of your country before we'll even talk peace. Absolutely ridiculous plan, but it was almost a ridiculous versus ridiculous point counterpoint. As the ridiculous 10-point peace plan goes forward, the Russians offer their ridiculous surrender terms to the Ukrainians. So nobody seems to be really serious about peace talks at this point. The impact of the international sanctions on the Russian economy, briefly talked about. It's the long-term health. The Russian economy is still growing, but they're doing it through a combination of deficit spending, also focusing more on leaning into their commodities base, oil and gas, and less on trying to develop more of a non-commodity based economy. So they've basically focused on things that they do well, and basically, mainly due to the sanctions, they have not been able to develop other parts of their economy through either services or through providing manufactured goods. You don't see a lot of countries buying Russian weapons because Russia's using everything they got right now. So it's really put a cramp on Russia's economy outside of the commodities. Now, the Russian economy, it is true, they are growing. Most of it is growing due to defense spending that is being subsidized either through deficits or through trading oil at a discount, mainly to the Chinese and the Indians, and then also support mainly from dual-use items that they get from the Chinese to help them in their economy to keep it growing. These are things that, in my opinion, and there's economists that are much more gifted than I am, I'm saying that the Russians are trading their future growth to be able to support this war. That's not unusual in wartime situations, but at some point the piper comes and they've got to pay. The Russians do have favorability with the Chinese. Not sure if the Chinese will be willing to help them out with some of their war debts. That's to be said, but can't really talk about it now because they are in the middle of a war. If Ukraine continues to receive Western support, both financial and military, they do not face immediate destruction on the battlefield. The Russians have a much larger force, but again, the Ukrainians are on the strategic defensive. They are in strong positions, but they are not. They can be dislodged when the Russians focus their energy. They are able to push out through these long grinding offensive. They're able to push the Ukrainians out of territories, but these aren't big sweeping offensives. They're not taking a lot of ground. They're creating a lot of casualties on the Ukraine side and taking large casualties on their own. So there is no these slow grinding offensives. It just doesn't look like the Russians have the ability or the appetite to conduct large sweeping offensives like they did, let's say, in World War II. In fact, they fought in these regions, and so the Soviet Union taking back large swaths of territory from a determined enemy, the German army. The Russians do not have that appetite to do that, and maybe they don't have the ability to mobilize larger parts of their armed forces. Or they're not willing to take this level of casualties, or they're not willing to dislocate to a full wartime economy. So the Russians are not, at this point, not really pursuing this grandiose strategy to overrun Ukraine, because most likely they can't do it. If they could do it, it would cost them a lot more, both in lives and material and economic. Again, they're trading off their future growth for maintaining growth right now. So the Ukrainians are not in a great position, but they're not facing immediate destruction. The other side that pushes back against the Russians trying to take more and more territory is as they move further and further away from the Russian-speaking populations of eastern Ukraine and further west, you're going to run into the more of the less mixed areas that are away from the Russian border, and these people are more Ukrainian and more nationalistic. The Russians probably, I would say pretty safely, do not want to create an occupation force in this region. They thought Afghan style resistance was bad. This would be much worse because you could probably consider there would still be Russian or Western aid to fight the Russians. So the Russians most likely do not want to create a larger occupation force, even if they get help from places like North Korea, which is sending 4 engineering brigades into Russian-occupied Ukraine. So you can expect that we'll start seeing North Korean soldiers. There's also a report out this week talking about there's Indian volunteers in the Russian military that felt like they've been duped, and apparently that's been an issue with the president of India. But this amount of international support of manpower for the Russians is not big enough to try to occupy larger and larger sections of Ukraine in a face of a very hostile population, while still maintaining a front line against the Ukrainians. It's just not something they want to do. Even if I argue that they're not capable of doing it. They could be capable of doing it if they were willing to go to a full wartime economy and mobilize large parts of their population, which again will cost them future growth in their economy. The West recognizes that Ukraine needs support to support, and this promises of unwavering support, increased aid to help Ukraine fend off its demographic crisis has started becoming a concern for the West because, again, you can give them all the weapons in the world, but if they're just running out of manpower to man these weapons, yes, you can. And again, the West doesn't have time to pull all these Ukrainian soldiers back to NATO countries and train them in these weapon systems. Or more sophisticated weapon systems or better tactics. There's just not time. They don't have. Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of doing that. So it's pretty much give them weapons that they can train relatively easy. May not be able to use them effectively as the West would. They don't have the air power like the West would have. You could argue this is one of the cases with all the armored vehicles that were given to the Ukrainians last year, is they were not necessarily used in a manner that you would expect Western armies to use them. And there was, I don't want to say heavy casualties, but there was a fair portion of Western armor that was destroyed by the Russians, most likely used in a way that the West would not have used them. Also tells you somewhat of the sophistication of both sides where they're when it comes to anti-tank weapons. So what the West is concerned is that even though this demographic issue that's weighing on the Ukrainians, the West is concerned that they cannot sustain the support for the Ukraine war indefinitely. It's not, I call it war fatigue, but it's not war fatigue from the point that the Ukrainians are having to deal with, and the Russians as well. This is war fatigue of just asking for more and more money from the Western economies, the Western people, or the people of the Western economies, which are, again, they're not getting bombed, they're not getting necessarily starved or short on resources like you would see the Ukrainians, and to a lesser extent the Russians. The West is dealing with dramatic slowdowns in their economy, higher inflation, higher energy prices, a general sense of anxiety over the war, especially in the European countries, the Eastern European countries that are so close to this war. At some point, especially in the Western parts that are away from the front line, because you'll probably find more fervor in Poland and the Finland and the Baltic countries than you will in, let's say, Spain, Portugal, Italy, that don't feel the direct threat of the Ukraine invasion, United States for that matter as well, Great Britain. So you're going to see a type of war fatigue coming from the West where the citizens are in not optimistic of economic times and are asked to give more and more money to a cause which they may not be seeing as a direct threat to them. Not saying right or wrong, but it's going to create this war support fatigue among its electorate. That's one of the things the West have to be concerned about. You can already see it in politics in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, where either increased military spending or support for the Ukraine war has been a weighing factor on the Western politicians. So the war has basically at this point reached this feudal stage. There's no real prospect of victory for either side. In the current way the battlefield's running. Russians can't really dislodge the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can't hold on forever. But how much longer, how many more casualties does the Russians have to take? Are they willing to occupy a larger parts of the country, the hostile population? It's just getting to the point that neither side is going to get that real prospect of the victory. The Russians aren't going to get what their original war aims. They're not going to get the Ukraine population or government removed. Ukrainians, unfortunately, will not get their territory back. It's just not going to happen. The West is concerned about, again, the continued ongoing support of the war, while at the same time they're wanting to increase the strength of their armed forces. It's hard for them and their fragmented economic prospects to do that, which is one of the discussion topics at the NATO summit. So, Viktor Orban, this is the situation that Viktor Orban comes in as the president of the EU. He has been a skeptic of the Ukraine war, and he is considered to have close ties with Russia. He also has fairly close ties with China as well. So kind of view it from an imperfect messenger, but his ideas of ending the war are not wrong. It's, again, you can find fault with the messenger. You may not like the conclusions he have reached, but it's from a sober reminder that he does have a point about the war is futile at this time. It's just creating casualties, and there's no prospect of winning for anybody at this point. So Orban is attempting to restart the peace talks to end the war. And he's not trying to pick the Swiss format. He's not trying to pick the Russian, the Chinese formats. Russian format is, Ukraine surrendered the Donbass to them. So he's taking a different point of view. And when I talked about the Swiss peace talks, it was really going to have to come from a country that was outside of G7, G20, Switzerland, the BRICS countries. It was going to have to come from a neutral player. And that's where I think, again, this comes into imperfect messengers again. Hungary, maybe the Slovak Republic, Turkey, all maintain relatively good relations with both countries, Ukraine and Russia. So it might have to come, peace talks might have to come from countries like this. Even in Asia, it's getting harder to find countries that are neutral countries. When you go in there and you look at either they're in the Russian sphere of influence, like Central Asia, you've got the Gulf states are more involved with the politics of the Palestine-Israeli war in Gaza than they are to get involved in peace talks with the to end the war in Ukraine, even though they may not like the war. They've kind of got their other priorities on their end. Asia, obviously North Korea is supporting. Who would want North Korea as an arbiter for peace? But North Korea is firmly in the Chinese and Russian camps. Japan and South Korea are Australia, New Zealand are definitely into the U.S. Camp. Philippines have got their own issues dealing with the Chinese, and they're trying to focus on their region. Indonesia has generally been shown to be more favorable to the Chinese side. India, BRICS country. So there's just not a lot of huge players. South America could play a role, but Brazil is a BRICS country, so it's going to be heavily influenced by Russia. Argentina, I don't know if they'll get buy-in from some of the Western European countries because the the president that's been elected down there. But just the point is, there's not a lot of countries that can have the trust of both Russia and Ukraine. And so there's just a few imperfect players out there that could do this. Again, you could probably argue some of the Gulf states could do it. But again, most of them are focused on the Gaza war. So Orban is one of those imperfect messengers. And so the Orban took the position of EU leadership, and he actually met twice with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has also reached this conclusion, or seems to have reached the conclusion, that the criticism of the Swiss Peace Conference of not allowing the Russians have caused, not allow the Russians to attend, has caused a lot of issues and hurt the international credibility of the Ukraine peace plan. So he's trying to reach the same conclusion, that there has to be some way to create at least a roadmap of what a ceasefire and what a peace could look like that is something more than dictating terms. And I'll probably talk more about this in a later point, maybe this week, about things that have come out of the NATO conference involving discussions over the Ukraine war that are a little bit deeper than just the headlines and some of the issues that President Zelensky of Ukraine are dealing with. So Viktor Orban met with the Ukrainian president in Kyiv, and he also met with him in Brussels first, then Kyiv. And he just flat out asked for a ceasefire to the war to start peace negotiations. So his idea is just stop the killing. Everybody agreed to a ceasefire in their lines, and let's start discussing how we can discuss peace. But the idea is stop the shooting first. Orban did admit that any type of final peace will require a significant amount of time. But again, he's advocating we don't need to negotiate, or the world doesn't need to negotiate every point just to start peace negotiations. A ceasefire needs to be the first step. You don't have to have an agreement except for stop shooting, stop killing to start a ceasefire. That was rejected by the Ukrainians, and they did make the point in their meeting that the Ukrainians gave their counterpoint of view. Prime Minister Orban did admit that he saw some of the Ukrainians' positions on it. So he did not dismiss the Ukrainians' position out of hand, where the Ukrainians seem to have rejected the Viktor Orban. But the point with Orban, or the advantage he has, is, again, he can be that go-between with the Russians. And Zelensky knows that because he's having to try to create some type of peace plan that involves discussing with the Russians. Orban or Erdogan of Turkey is probably those countries that can be a go-between to start the ceasefire going. So Zelensky knows that he's already formulating, he's got to come up with a peace plan. So he knows somebody like Orban, and who is now the president of the EU, can help with this cause. Now, the other part of it is Orban, after finishing with Kyiv, sorry, I used the Russian name, Kyiv, he flew directly to Moscow. He got censured by the EU for doing so. The EU that he's president of, the European Commission, said he cannot negotiate on behalf of the EU. But in all fairness to Viktor Orban, he did not go as a member of the EU. He went as the member of Prime Minister of Hungary. He did not present the part that he was somehow he was representing the EU. That was overreaction from EU leaders and people and leaders in the European Commission. He did not state that, but he is using, I call it the bully pulpit. He is the president of the EU, and he is taking that highlighted position, higher profile position, to start these peace talks, where he visited Vladimir Putin. Again, he went there too, just like the Ukrainians. He said, got to stop the war. Will you be willing to have a ceasefire immediately. The Russians did reject this. They made their point that any negotiation would have to include Ukraine, of course. That was just part of him Putin putting his hitch onto the international criticism of the Swiss Peace Conference. But Orban was not rejected out of hand by either the Ukrainians or the Russians. They did not agree to a ceasefire, but they did not reject his peace offers either. So there's no real high hopes that this is going to lead to a peace. But if they start talking, this is a big part of it. Now, the other thing was Zelensky, president of Ukraine. He cannot just simply reject Orban because eventually, at some point, Ukraine most likely will become a member of the EU. This is separate of the NATO agreement. They will most likely become a member of the EU. And they're going to need that, if not even a member or as a partner, some type of partnership with the EU, is this war-devastated country of Ukraine is going to need financial support from the international community. Russia used to be a fair-sized partner with Ukraine. That is gone. The Russians are not going to offer, and the Ukrainians will not take Russian aid because there's going to be a lot of hard feelings between the two countries for the foreseeable future. So President Zelensky needs the EU, and he cannot afford to. First off, he already knows that he has to formulate a peace plan. He's got to find a way to talk directly to the Russians, and he needs EU foreign aid for eventual rebuilding of his country once this war is over. So he cannot dismiss the president of the EU out of hand, even if he doesn't really care for it. Also, President Zelensky knows that time is of the essence, where he has to get something to start some type of roadmap for peace with the Russians. So Orban does have a point there. So we'll see how it goes. As I stated before, is there's just very few players that could be the go-between, because at this point these two countries are going to need an arbiter. They're going to need to be somebody that can shuttle between the two countries if they won't meet face to face, where they could sit there and present both arguments and try to hold some form of call it a referee between the two countries. Again, probably not the choice of most countries, but it looks like this is what you have. You have EU, Turkey, and maybe a handful of other countries that could do that. And only one of those countries is the president of the EU right now. And apparently he's taking full advantage that one of his missions as EU president, even though he got censured by the very same EU for going to Russia, is he's trying to use his position to convince the world that maybe it's time to start talking peace. All right, so the second paper this week was Fears Over Russian Space-Based Indiscriminate Weapons. I felt like this was a revisit of a bad movie called, Space Cowboys with the great Clint Eastwood, which was really a bad movie, but that's what this reminded me of when I started reading about the concerns, which seem to be legitimate concerns of some of the activities of the Russians in space, which is probably because the Russians have been pressing, saying that they were going to escalate. They're going to escalate. Every time the West escalates, they says there will be some form of escalation. So this is probably something like that. This is whether this is a real threat or if this is something that's going to come about. Not sure, but it is an actual real threat for the West, or for mainly the United States, and somewhat, I would say, a lesser extent to China, but it would probably be Russian actions in space could be just as devastating to China as it could be to the U.S., and probably more so for China because they do not have a lot of experience of military operations, and the U.S. does. And we can go into this, but I think this would actually be more devastating to the Chinese. So it makes me wonder, how serious is this? So anyway, the Russians launched a satellite called Cosmos 2576 from its Plesetsk Cosmodrome, which is actually in Russia and is in the north, I think in the Murmansk area. Most Russian rockets are launched from Kazakhstan. So this is an unusual, this is not unusual, but this is a different location, and it's within the borders of Russia where they launched Cosmos 2576. And this launch was on May 16th, and this led to a United States response on the floor of the United Nations Security Council on May 20th. So this is something that the U.S. took seriously, which you normally not see from satellite launches, even spy satellite launches. So the concern is that Cosmos 2576 is believed to be what's called a counter space weapon. It is considered to be capable of either eavesdropping or possibly attacking satellites in low Earth orbit. So things that are in low Earth orbit are not only a significant portion of your spy satellites, but it also is the Hubble Space Telescope, the International Space Station, commercial imaging satellites like you see Google Earth, Starlink constellations, and other similar constellations of Starlink. These are all in low Earth orbit. So the launch has raised concerns about the weaponization of space and the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which forbids the deployment of nuclear weapons in Earth orbit, on the moon, or in orbit of any on the moon, or in the orbit of the moon, or any celestial body. So the concern is, well, why are we talking about nuclear weapons in space when we were just talking about a satellite launch that has rose the ire of the United States inside the United Nations Security Council? So we will get to that because this Cosmos launch is not a nuclear weapon, but it brought up some other issues. So in October 2006, President George W. Bush, his administration made a significant revision to the United States National Space Policy, and allowing the U.S. Space Force, it was originally the U.S. Air Force's Space Command, is now, that was taken over by the U.S. Space Force, to take military action in space to protect U.S. space assets and deny space to a U.S. adversary. You can't do this unless you're talking about the use of some type of offensive weaponry in space or ground-based weaponry to attack places in space, or you're talking about shooting down missiles or rockets before they can get to orbit. But it definitely shows that there's this allowed some form of weaponization of space to deny the access of space to an adversary of the United States. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had explored orbitable and ground-based weapon systems to attack targets prior to 2006. U.S. Star Wars would be an example introduced by the Reagan administration. The Bush's administration's 2006 decision was based on the U.S. becoming a more dominant in space and launching more capable satellites. And you can see that today. It's like the vast majority of satellite launches come from the United States. More and more of our assets come from the United States. During the Gulf War, for example, the GPS system allowed the U.S. military to navigate successfully in the desert, a featureless desert. That was the first real started where space had gone. That was considered immense. The original Tomahawk cruise missiles, from what I understand, and I'm sure I'm getting all the technical terms, had basically a visual map loaded into them. That has been taken over by satellite targeting, or at least the option of satellite targeting. So it's becoming from the very early days of using GPS to now satellites being used for helping get weapons to targets, for surveillance, for secure communications. It's becoming more and more important to the United States as far as space assets go. And it's important to the intelligence collection and communications on top of, again, targeting. The Russian flight, go back to it, Cosmos 2576, is not the first of its kind flight, but it's concerning to the U.S. because it was launched in the only purpose for 2576. It was launched in the same orbital plane as a U.S. Keyhole 11 spy satellite called designated US 314. Cosmos 2576 is in the same orbital plane as US 314. So that's where the uproar came in there, because they believe that this Cosmos satellite is going to either test how anti-satellite capabilities, it's going to be possibly spy on a U.S. spy satellite. Again, not a first of its kind mission. Or is this an attempt to ram the satellite? Now, the two satellites don't get too close to each other right now in the current orbital plane. I think, I'm going by memory here, I think once every 4 days they get within 30 miles, which is relatively close when you talk about space terms. So they're not expecting rain, but also they don't know if the Cosmos 2576 can maneuver. So it's probably not going to ram the satellite. And most likely it's going to be practicing how an attack satellite would approach another satellite. Could also be telling the U.S., we have the capability, me and the Russians, we have the capability to go after your satellites. So it is concerning to the U.S. One thing we run into is when you start talking about weapons in space, the Russians are not as related. They're a continental power, the significant continental power. They do have nuclear weapons, but they are not so reliant on space-based systems. They don't have to. They could still use microwave communications. They could still use some of the old technology that we used to use in the U.S. in the starting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where before we relied on satellite systems. The Russians are still relying on these systems, and they are not. They can send a few, like 2 ships over to Cuba. They can operate in the Western Pacific, relatively close to the shore. And they can operate in Syria from air bases, connected air bases, flying over Russia. Of course, this was prior to Ukraine war. They don't have that world projection like the U.S. does. So they don't need a sophisticated satellite system to provide the secure worldwide communications, or to provide all the targeting information. They just are not as reliant on that, because they don't have to be powerful. So the U.S. is definitely in a disadvantaged position that they are more, the U.S., is more susceptible to a Russian attack in scale than what the Russians are to a U.S. attack. So why are we saying all this? So it's because that obviously this satellite 2576 is not a nuclear weapon satellite, but what's the concern is, and this has been talked about in Washington, is that there's concern that the Russians will be able to consider deploying nuclear weapons on satellites that are meant to disrupt the satellite system, not to launch nuclear weapons down to targets on the U.S., or on the U.S., mainly U.S., but in the world, not on earthly targets. These are the idea and the concepts that the United States and the West are pretty sure that the Russians have this capability, and this is something they're trying to develop. Again, it might be developed as a threat and not necessarily a real weapon. We'll talk about that here in a moment. The concern is, again, they're going to put nuclear weapons in space to attack other satellites in low Earth orbit. They could probably look at it as moving it to further up into mid and high up orbits. But the problem is you start needing more, there's more space, there's more gap between satellites. So it's much harder, or you have to put more weapons the further away you get in space, because just the way the circle gets bigger, bigger, and bigger as you get away from low Earth orbit, it might be just too much to do. So low Earth is where most of the concern, and that's where some of the most useful satellites are located, is in low Earth orbit, especially when you're talking about a military position. So the explosion of possibly Russians putting many nuclear satellites or nuclear armed satellites into orbit is obviously there's a kinetic side of it. Anything that's close to the nuclear weapon when it blows up could obviously destroy a satellite. That is obviously, again, a clear threat, but it's not the kinetic concerns that have to do with the nuclear weapons in space. It's the non-kinetic, and that's mainly going into the flash, destroying satellite optics and other optical reliant devices on a satellite, which could also, again, that could also impact solar panels. Not 100% sure, but I definitely know that they know that a flash of a nuclear weapon on a open optic would most likely burn it out. Example would be on Apollo 12, where they accidentally took the lens cap off while the lens was fully open, and it burned out the device sensor on the moon just because of how bright the sun was. This is where, again, that was, I know, a bad example. 60 years ago, things have changed, but you're talking about something as bright as a nuclear flash, and you're talking about very sensitive optics that can read newspapers from low Earth orbit. These things are very sensitive to any type of damage. So that's a concern, but the bigger concern is the electromagnetic pulse. EMP would render the electronics and communications of the satellites useless. Now, it would be, we know that there are solar storms that occur, and some satellites are somewhat reinforced, and there's probably a case of military satellites are more reinforced than others. But the EMP will be more powerful than the effects of a solar storm that takes days to reach here. The immediate impact of EMP on satellites relatively close would be very concerning, and most likely even reinforced satellites to withstand more significant solar storms would probably be rendered useless as well, unless they're at the extreme range of the electromagnetic pulse. So the other part, so obviously you burn out the electronics, so you go in here, so it's like you haven't really created debris, except for you're going to lose attitude control inside these satellites, and they could start potential of running into each other. Also, you can't control the orbit, so not sure how that goes in there, but it's going to possibly create a big mess in low Earth orbit. So again, an indiscriminate bomb. So you go in there and the Russians blow up a nuclear weapon in space as what's called a non-discriminate or indiscriminate, because it's not looking at a specific satellite. It's just picking a point in space and blowing up. And it's using its kinetic, but a little more importantly, its non-kinetic effects to destroy satellites, whether physically destroying or just burning out the electronics. So it's indiscriminate. So it doesn't matter. When this Russian weapon goes off in this point in space, everybody's satellites impacted. The Russians, the Chinese, the US, whoever else, everybody's impacted. It's indiscriminate. The Russians can't protect it. Maybe they can pick a point is further away from one of their satellites, but for the most part, they when they go in there and they blow one up in this point in space in low Earth orbit, everything's impacted, no matter what the countries are. And this goes back into the fact that the Russians are less of a global power and more of a continental power, and can rely on other things, other sources outside of the satellites. Again, microwaves, for example. So the Russians, they blow up their satellites, but they're going to be less impacted than the US and China. because again, they are less reliant on satellites for their military and civilian applications and more reliant on ground-based systems. So the deployment of these indiscriminate or non-discriminate nuclear armed satellites would be against the Outer Space Treaty, but the U.S. has little else it can do to punish Russia. U.S. has used up just about all sanction options over the Ukraine war, so there's very little stick that the U.S. has. So all they have right at this point is a carrot, outside of if they want to cut Russian oil out of the market. That's really the only real lever that's left to pull. Everything else is, most of it's been pulled. And the more the U.S. pulls further and further on this, the weaker and weaker they create the dollar as far as being the world reserve currency. So there's only so much the U.S. can do as far as punishment to Russia. And so what other carrots could they offer? Obviously at the Ukraine war, or some type of incentive for the Russians to come to a bargaining table, that could help them, and maybe it could be used to help the Russians pull back from indiscriminate satellite weapons. China, they could also try to get China to entice China to also go through and try to convince the Russians not to do this, because the Chinese are going to be in impact as well. Because China, for example, they've had traditionally been a continental power as well, but they're talking about invading Taiwan. Again, this is still within that continental area, but then they're talking about extending past the first and second island chain into the Central Pacific. This is stuff where you actually need satellite systems to help you help a country with targeting. This is beyond those normal capabilities. If they want to carry a larger war into the deeper into Western and all the way to the Central Pacific, they are going to need these satellite systems. So the Chinese are creating a military capability, as far as satellites go, very similar to the U.S., and they would be also vulnerable to these indiscriminate weapons. So maybe there's a way that they could convince the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians not to do this. Again, not saying the Russians are immediately going to do this, but it looks like they are looking at the capabilities. Now, if the U.S. cannot dissuade Russia either through very few sticks it has left, offering a carrot to the Russians, or helping or get the help of the Chinese to do it, it has to bolster its passive defensive measures of U.S. space assets, or to create an active defense system against potential attacks. Now, easier said than done, because you're talking about all those satellites up there that don't have robust defense systems like reinforced electronics from an EMP attack. They're going to have to be replaced. And so it's not like we can just go up there. I mean, the U.S. just can't go up there and replace every one of their satellites in a relatively short notice. The Chinese are going to be the same way. So the other action is you have to create an active defense system against potential attacks. That means finding a way to disable the Russian nuclear weapon satellites in orbit. Okay, there's several ways you could do that. Again, you could go into an anti-satellite system similar to, what was it called, the ASM-135 that the U.S. developed in the 80s, mid-80s, that could shoot down, launch from an F-15 Eagle fighter, could shoot down a low Earth orbit satellite. You would be able to have something like that, and you would have to be able to do it almost simultaneously. Let's say the Russians put, this is all theoretical, they put out 20 satellites, the U.S. would have to destroy all 20 or disable all 20 satellites at the same time, because the EMP effect is, you could have a whole section that could be rendered blind. So just doing it piecemeal is not going to work. It has to be a coordinated attack to take down the Russian nuclear weapons in space. Very, very hard to do. Something that's never been tried before. You would have to test that capability, and then the testing that capability is probably going to tip the Russians off. So it's a very difficult position that the U.S. would be put in by trying to counter these. And also this technology that the Russians are talking about developing, this does not need a lot of special ways of being created, no special technologies. This is a capability that the Russians have had probably since the late 1960s. This is not groundbreaking technology to do this. There's probably going to be some more sophistication to make sure that maybe the U.S. cannot encrypt into the signals and take over the satellite cryptically. So obviously there's going to have to be some part, but this is the basic idea of putting a nuclear weapon satellite in space. This is not groundbreaking technology, well within the capacity of the Russians to do this, well within the capacity of us to do it, well within the capacity of most of your Western countries to do this. So this is not groundbreaking technology that has to be developed. Groundbreaking technology would be finding a system that could counter these would be much more difficult and very expensive to do. So you're talking about the Russians do this is that you're talking about a potential arms race in space that will probably involve China and most likely India. Why involving China is because obviously China is again, indiscriminate weapons are indiscriminate weapons. It doesn't care who they are. So the Chinese would also have to find a way to start putting weapons in space, whether to use to eliminate the Russian satellites or any potential U.S. satellite. Maybe China gets involved and starts taking out U.S. satellites as part of their warfare in the Western Pacific to help their cause, vice versa with the U.S. Also, if China becomes effective in using discriminate weapons to take out U.S. satellites, that maybe they could convince the Russians through those measures not to use these weapons in space. The other part with these indiscriminate attack is eventually all the debris you're going to create in low Earth orbit. This has been a problem right now, not through occasional satellite weapons testing, but also just collisions, satellites that break before they can go into parking orbit. There's just a lot of debris in low Earth orbit. These types of attacks is going to create more debris. So eventually, if this does happen, the West will have to find a way to work through the how to operate in low Earth orbit again by clearing space debris, wait for it eventually to deorbit and burn up in the atmosphere. The other concern is that, mid-orbit and upper Earth orbit will not be impacted, but if you can't get through low Earth orbit because of all the debris, that's a problem. So not saying it will close low Earth orbit, these weapons, but it's going to make a concerning issue into a alarming issue as far as operating in low Earth orbit. So is this going to happen? Probably not. It's probably another Russian threat. But it's something that's well within their capacity to do. So this is, again, nothing groundbreaking to be able to do this. All right. So next article is the midweek video. Macron criticizes U.S. and Germany ahead of NATO summit over the Ukraine membership. So French President Emmanuel Macron, he stepped in it, I think. So anyway, this comes from the fact that French elections occurred in France. These were snap elections called. I guess, do they call them snap elections in France? But these were parliamentary elections that Macron called, his right to do so as president of France, because of losses in the European Parliament. His party lost in the European Parliament. So he dissolves the French Parliament and calls new elections. And the first round of elections, the arch rival to Emmanuel Macron, Marine Le Pen, National Rally Party, took a dominant position in the elections. Um, Now, French have two-step elections. So in the second round of elections, the call them backroom deals, call it pucker-fector negotiations, however you want to describe them. These occurred, and lo and behold, on the second round of elections, National Rally is bumped from its first place position down to third place. Now, odd thing about this, not going to get into particulars of the French election system. National Rally had the most seats, the most votes, but they get the third most, or they won the most votes. And when you look at how the districts break down, they won the most districts, the way I understand. But they placed third place in seats. So they didn't gain a majority. This is a plurality. There's a number of other parties. So Macron, apparently in his backroom dealings to prevent National Rally from taking over in the French Parliament, he basically helped form an unholy alliance with the leftists of the NFP, National Front, I think, which is a motley collection. It's not an actual party. It's just a collection of socialists, communists, National Socialists. You read into that name however you want. I would say, how would they describe them? Anti-capitalist, obviously, radical environmentalists. Antifa was involved in that too. I know and then the communists. Communist Party in France, I won't say, they're not a dominant party, but they've always kind of been there. It's been a relatively, I don't want to say strong position, but they've been there and they've been active in politics in France. So the left wing, this collection of left wing parties, is now the number one party through the second election as far as seats go. And second place was Macron's party, who actually finished third in the voting as far as the number of votes, but is second in the position. So again, weird things in France. Won't talk about it. But the point is, and I talked about this at the G7 meeting, is Macron is weakened. His party is no longer in control of Parliament. It's going to be hard for him to get things done. He's even talking about some way of not seating the new prime minister, which would have the NFP backing. Not sure how he's going to do this, but he said that he's not settled with lefts taking over. Anyway, so I guess you just keep running the same elections over and over again until you get the results you want. I don't know. But the point is, Macron is weakened. So he heads to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. that runs from July 9th through the 11th. So he heads to the Potomac River to get away from his problems on the Seine. And so heading in there, he criticizes the U.S. and Germany ahead of the NATO summit. Now, France, Germany under Chancellor Olaf Scholz is not as close to France as the previous German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So there is a rivalry between France and Germany. UK's, because it's not in the European Union, it tends to be less of a concern for France. France is trying to get Macron was trying, prior to the elections, the French parliamentary elections, was trying to recraft the European Union into something in the French, call it a Charles de Gaulle type model, Gaullism. And so he was looking at ways of taking over or becoming the dominant power in the EU, even offering that French nuclear weapons would serve the EU's purpose, making the European Union a nuclear power. Going that far. So he was really trying to reform. And so he's also been trying to get the U.S. saying that maybe the U.S. needs to be less involved in European politics and let the Europeans take care of the Europeans and let the U.S. with its worldwide commitments think about taking China away. And he threw called the olive branch saying, well, it's not fair for the Europeans to try to keep the Americans in Europe when they have other commitments elsewhere, such as China. He's really trying to create this void. He wants to fill the void left behind by the U.S. leaving Europe, and he wants to craft Europe into some type of model under the French, basically under French domination. EU would eventually have a military. EU would have French nuclear weapons. It means that the French would be the dominant power in calling policy in the EU. So he was definitely wanting to form this. And he was using the Ukraine war to get there, to justify all these changes. You remember early in the Ukraine war, France was not a big player. This was driven mainly by the U.S., the Germans, the United Kingdom. France was for its size of economy and military, it was not playing a big role in supporting Ukraine. This changed in 2023, where President Macron was trying to fill the void left behind, or trying to fill a void as U.S. Aid was held up, and European Union aid was held up. So he tried to put France into a driving position, tried to use the Ukraine war as a wedge issue. For example, allowing his policy of the day, he's been arguing for a while, is he wants to allow unrestricted use of Western weapons against Russia. He has sent troops, 1,500 foreign legionnaires, to central Ukraine. He has threatened Russia. He's talked about that if Russia breaks through, more French troops will arrive in Ukraine. Not sure how he supports them in an active war zone. There has to be a logistics chain that has to be to support it. But anyway, he threatens it. Don't sure how he really projects power on a land-based country. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he's really using the latest crisis in the Ukraine war, mainly around funding, and within U.S. and European Union, and also U.S. commitments into Asia. So he's really using this to his advantage, the Ukraine war. Not saying he doesn't care about the Ukrainian cause. He is the only one that put troops into the ground. But there is a... this isn't Macron being the all in on the Ukraine war. This is a useful tool to try to reshape Europe into the Gaullism type vision. So again, U.S. and Germany are considered obstacles to where he wants to go. One thing that you run into with NATO is, so he's gone in there, his criticism, this time around, his criticism, being Macron, is he says the reason why NATO, or why Ukraine is not being offered NATO membership, is because the U.S. and Germany oppose it. Yes, it is true that both the U.S. and Germany oppose it. U.S. and Germany, again, these are his his rivals, not arch rivals, but his rivals in trying to dominate Europe. There's other countries that are against this. Again, remember, NATO requires unanimous consent. You can guarantee that you're not going to get Slovak Republic, Hungary, Turkey, U.S., Germany. I would say that there will probably be some other Eastern European countries that would not offer support either, not immediately. And most likely, a majority of the countries are in the German position as far as the reason why they don't want to give support. It is most likely that they would not even get, while the war in Ukraine is going on, is that a majority of NATO countries will give support for Ukraine joining NATO. Again, this all changes when the war ends, that it could change that dynamic. But right now, while they're at war, I don't see NATO. You're definitely not getting unanimous consent. You're probably not even getting majority consent. But he's focusing on his two arch rivals that are blocking his vision of Europe. So one thing that goes in there is, first off, why was it the U.S. going to offer NATO membership? Definitely, the president is President Biden is sympathetic to Ukraine joining NATO, but he has concerns about them being at war. But he also knows that NATO membership, the U.S. requires it to be passed through the Senate as far as the treaty advice and consent rule. That requires a 2/3 majority of senators. When Finland and Sweden both came up, I think they were approved like 95-1 and 94-1 with I don't remember who the vote against was on either one of them. There was a fair amount of there's 100 senators and 96 and 95 voted. There's abstentions, but so they got their 2/3 majority, and they didn't have to have a formalized vote because there was just there was almost unanimous support for this. But Ukraine, like other members, the U.S. Senate, the minority party in the Senate, can't rely back onto the rules of the Senate that come from the Constitution requiring 2/3 majority. You will not get a 2/3 majority while Ukraine is at war from the U.S. Senate. President Biden would have to give significant concessions to mainly the Republicans, but even some within his own party, to get a 2/3 majority, and that would probably include something like border security has been tied up in Ukraine aid. So those likely that was something that, again, that's not something that the president wants to give into, especially on an election year. So no, the U.S. is not going to offer because they know that U.S. Senate difficulty is not going to happen. As I said earlier, that's not the only support. So the others, not the only country I won't support. So the other one that's specifically called out was Germany by Macron. Germany publicly opposes Ukraine membership because Ukraine is in a state of war. So that is their public position, and it will most likely be a public position of many NATO countries. So again, I think Ukraine would even have a hard time for majority. So why are they calling? So France is calling out Germany and the U.S. because, again, talk about the U.S. These are obstacles to his Gaullism view of what he wants to turn Europe into. So now, NATO's bylaws does not say that you cannot be a member, or you can still become a member while at war. Basically, the Ukraine charter is silent on war. Now, the issue is with a state being at war is, how do you deal with Article 5? That's kind of the heart of NATO. That's the collective security rule. Attack on one is an attack on all. How do you manage that article when you're already at war? So that's the big question. So it's, yes, they're not at war, or it doesn't, the rules don't say the country has to be at peace to become a member of NATO, but how do you handle Article 5? And if you do start running into where Article 5 support is weak, that only weakens NATO as a whole. And I talked about that last week about as you add more and more countries, the weaker Article 5 potentially gets, because you run into more and more countries that have different views and different measures of threats. So they might have a different view on Article 5. Now, the other thing is that when 1995, NATO came up with some rules about how to bring in Eastern European and former Soviet bloc countries into NATO. And so they created a series of rules, which include no territorial disputes, border disputes, that cannot be handled peacefully. So you can have a border dispute, but it has to be handled peacefully. Ukraine's already at a war over border disputes in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So, that kind of invalidates that. It says that you have to have a functioning democracy. Ukraine, as a war measure, have instituted martial law. They have suspended habeas corpus. They have suspended elections. For example, President Zelensky's term ran out in April 2024. So there's no Ukrainian elections right now. So that's one that goes against. That's another law that goes against that. So the minimum requirement, and then also a market-based economy, they're kind of struggling. Now you can argue about some of the martial law because they've been invaded by a foreign country. That yes, maybe you can understand martial law being imposed. Yes, maybe you can understand writ of habeas corpus being involved. And allies for Ukraine on this point out that the U.S. during World War II interned Japanese and Japanese Americans into internment camps with no due process of law. And the U.S. has strong institutions of law and court. So this should not have happened, civil rights. So this should not have happened, but it still happened. So many supporters of Ukraine go back and says, well, the U.S. did that in World War II during mortal danger, and so we're doing it. Well, the U.S. still held elections in 42, 44. They, including a presidential election. The U.S. also during Civil War, while being under direct threat, they also held elections during the Civil War, including a presidential election. So this doesn't really hold a lot of water, even though you can kind of understand why they do it. But it cannot be used as something that NATO can simply wave away their rules. Even when it's silent on war, there's two areas right there that Ukrainians have not been able to overcome. So the whole idea of sitting there blaming the U.S. and Germany over not allowing NATO membership is a cheap shot by the French president, who's just his political power is wounded, his legacy is wounded. He's most likely not going to get what he wants in reshaping Europe. And this was just a chance to deflect from his problems, his domestic problems in France. It won't change his political fortunes. He still has to go back and deal with all the leftists that he helped get in charge in the country. And really all he's done is create another schism inside the alliance over Ukraine war policy. This is just a reckless statement by a French president who is mad because he sees the world that he wanted to create in Europe slipping away from him as his domestic political issues have redefined his presidency. As former Speaker of the House used to say, Tip O'Neill, all politics are local. So that's the world of hapless Emmanuel Macron and what he's dealing with. It was an unnecessary lash out. It created only more schisms within NATO. It did not help Ukraine at all, except maybe create more acrimony with the Ukrainians over not being offered NATO membership. Again, and this is something that the Americans that's been talked about since 2006 or 2007, offering Ukraine membership. They keep promising this and promising this. I'm not saying right or wrong. The Ukrainians are getting impatient about it now, especially under the after the West keeps promising them. Emmanuel Macron, because he's mad about his political fortunes going away, just threw more gas on that fire. So maybe he's just hoping he can bully his way in there, or maybe he's some way be viewed as some hero in Ukraine for arguing the Ukrainian cause. But he's just arguing because he's upset about his political fortunes. All right. So more to come on that. Interesting thing, something to watch out for is that he is talking about not seating the new prime minister of France. I'm not sure how he does that, but we'll see how that goes. So certainly more to come on France and the wounded Emmanuel Macron. All right, West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 8. China continues to intimidate the Philippines. The Philippines sticks to their strategy of highlighting bad acts of China in the West Philippine Sea. And there's some mixed messaging about de-escalation. All right. So obviously the something that's overhanging the region is the events of June 17th at the Second Thomas Shoal, with the Chinese Coast Guard using axes, knives, and spears to seize and the crews of two Philippine boats, military boats, seizing the crew, damaging equipment, destroying equipment with what I call the Chinese Coast Guard pirates. That is still looming over the region. There has not been any type of event that is even come close to that happening. So as both sides are steering away from the having another clash, they are basically just two sides just maneuvering around each other at this point. So the Philippines is tempting, their position is they are attempting to prevent escalation. Even their chief of general staff, coming from President, would take an order from President Marcos to have his forces de-escalate in the West Philippine Sea. So it's a public position that the Philippines are trying to de-escalate, but they're also not making a point that they will not relinquish its internationally recognized sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. This is something they also discussed when they had the previous week, when they had the bilateral talks, which China demands. The Philippines agreed to that demand, and the Philippines and China both, they were talking, but they both came away that they are, the Philippines said there was some progress, but they're still saying that the West Philippines is their sovereign territory. The Chinese Foreign Ministry was generally silent after the meeting, but they again stated that the West Philippine Sea belongs to them as part of the greater South China Sea. So they were talking, and they were trying to prevent an escalation, but the Philippines are actually trying to talk about de-escalation. The Chinese, on the other hand, are picking up the status of intimidation, mainly military intimidation through their Coast Guard and through their Navy, performing series of exercises in the area and being more highlighted in the with their Coast Guard. One interesting thing that started the event at June 17th, on June 15th, the Chinese said that they would start arresting any foreigners in the South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea, for trespassing, and they have not done that so far. But so they're kind of moving away from that. So it's almost like a tiger threat. Maybe they'll use it at some point. Go grab some innocent Malaysian fishermen to make a point of. But they're trying to avoid the Japanese. They're trying to avoid the Philippines. Definitely trying to avoid the Americans in the area. So they have not tried to enforce this new rule. But they are trying to do some intimidation tactics. And the area that they're focusing on this week is the Escoda Shoal. Now, the Escoda Shoal from the prior week, that's the one where after the June 17th incident and both sides talking, the Philippines were able to, we'll call it sneak in, sending building supplies, construction supplies, and other supplies to their garrison in their small garrison on the Escoda Shoal. Chinese were upset about that, but the Chinese did not try to interdict it like they did the June 17th incident with the Sierra Madre and the Second Thomas Shoal. But they did start moving their intimidation tactics with the Escoda Shoal. So Escoda Shoal, if you remember, in May and June, the Philippines discovered that the Chinese were starting to build up an artificial island in the shoal using ground up coral. And this is something that the Chinese have done on at least 30 other occasions in militarizing the South China Sea by creating artificial islands and using coral, ground up coral, as one of the building materials to build up the seafloor to bring the area above water and make it an island, artificial island. So the Escoto, so the response when the Philippines discovered this, and this is going to be part of, eventually it looks like it's going to be part of the court case, international court case in an unknown jurisdiction yet, most likely The Hague, but it's still not determined on that. The Philippines in response deployed their largest Coast Guard ship, the BRP Teresa Magbanua, excuse me if I butchered the name, I apologize for that, and 2 other smaller Coast Guard vessels to maintain a constant presence, basically to keep the Chinese away from their construction teams, away from trying to restart activities in the Escoto Shoal. Well, the Chinese responded this week by sending, making a point that they have 2 Coast Guard ships called the Monster, so there's 2 of them, and they're 12,000-ton ships. So the Philippines made the point they're sending their biggest Coast Guard ship to the Escoto Shoal to keep the Chinese away. The Chinese respond by sending their biggest Coast Guard vessel, called the Monster, to the Escoto Shoal. So you send your biggest, we're going to send our biggest. The Monster is a 12,000-ton ship and is 3 times bigger than the Philippines' biggest Coast Guard ship. And it made the point of dropping anchor 800 yards, 730 meters or so, from the Philippine ship. If that wasn't meant to be a message, basically just going in there and just, okay, I'm going to leave that visual off there. But basically that's going big message right there that, hey, you sent your biggest, and we're going to send one even bigger, and we're going to anchor at 800 yards away from your 730 meters from your biggest ship, which is nowhere near as big as our ship. It seems like a real metaphor when they put those 2 out there. So the Philippines reacted by saying, well, we're not going to be intimidated, even though they put their biggest ship out there. The Philippines said, we're not going to be intimidated. But it was just funny. It's like, okay, and why this matters is because a lot of the ramming incidents that have happened inside the various shoals in the West Philippine Sea, the general tonnage of Chinese Coast Guard ships, which are the ones that are conducting the ramming, are significantly bigger than the Philippine ships. That means, again, when you're talking about just sheer mass and ramming, the bigger you are, the less damage you're going to take by conducting these ramming exercises. Also means that let's say a 2,000-ton Philippine Coast Guard ship is not going to be able to ram a ship that is 2 times bigger without causing more damage to itself and doing almost nothing to the Chinese ship. Though there was some example that maybe some of those Chinese ships are pretty cheaply made, because a much smaller ship did put a pretty sizable hole in one Chinese Coast Guard vessel. The point is also the Chinese Coast Guard vessels, many of them are converted Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy ships that have basically had most of their weapons removed, mainly their vertical launchers. But if you look closely at a lot of those Chinese Coast Guard ships, you can see where the vertical launchers are. So these are generally bigger than most Coast Guard ships, because most Coast Guard ships are not converted warships like the Chinese are doing. So that's why the size matters when it comes to it. So that's why the Philippines sent their biggest Coast Guard ship, because it was going to be harder for the Chinese to ram it for whatever reason if they decided to choose that. So they weren't going to do that without damage to their ship, so they make a point of sending their biggest ship to it. So that's a lot of reason why you see that the size of the vessels matters in disputes within the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, is because the bigger ships of the Chinese, the heavier tonnage gives them the advantage of performing these types of intimidation exercises. The Japanese are they're building, have a contract to build Chinese or the Philippines Coast Guard ships to challenge the Chinese. Not sure if they're going to be of the same size as the Chinese ships, probably kind of doubtful, but you're probably going to see some more capable, eventually, Philippine Coast Guard ships coming online. But that's why, again, the size matters when it comes to how the tactics that roll out in the West Philippine Sea. So the Escoda Shoal comes back to another weak argument by the Chinese. The Escoda Shoal this is where the new court case is coming up. Again, the Philippine Justice Department is taking up to file it in an unnamed jurisdiction. I don't think the decision has been made where it's going to be filed. And the accusation is the damage that China did by environmental damage. Again, this is part of this media campaign to put China in a bad light, which is actually a good campaign, especially when you're talking about a communist society that's not an open society. Appearances is everything to the Chinese, and the Philippines are making the Chinese appearance look bad. So that's the point that the Philippine position is that there's environmental and seafloor damage done by the Chinese in their attempt to build an artificial island in the Escoda Shoal. The Chinese issued this weak counter-accusation that the grounding of the Sierra Madre in 1999 also damaged the shoal. So it was meant to make the Philippines look hypocritical in that them maintaining and not moving the Sierra Madre, and it caused coral damage, which is, I think that's probably a true statement. When you ground a ship, obviously you're going to do damage, and it does look like it's in a coral reef. So yeah, okay, the Chinese position is correct in that matter, but the Philippines smartly responded back saying, well, you've done the same thing 30 times. So it's just ridiculous. Just a really weak argument from the Chinese that it's easy to parry with pointing out that, hey, you guys have done a lot worse. So see where that court case goes. Again, it hasn't been filed yet, but it looks like it's coming. And this is not going to change Chinese behavior. It's just another thing to make them look bad in the light of the world. They look bad, it's harder to gather allies in the world. So another issue that made China look bad is the Philippines need to evacuate a service member from the Sierra Madre for medical reasons. They were able to get that person off and were able to get them to the hospital where they were in stable condition, and I'm sure they probably have been released by now. What came up was the Chinese Coast Guard tried to prevent the evacuation. And that was this coming from the Philippine side. Obviously, the Chinese ignored it or said, no, that's not right. But it does look like the Philippines have proof of the Chinese actions, against the Philippines. And this follows about a week ago, the Chinese Coast Guard was documented trying to obstruct the Philippine Coast Guard from rescuing two fishermen at the Panatag Shoal in the West Philippine Sea. Now, the Coast Guard in international waters is supposed to for the most part, they're supposed to render assistance. That's kind of the law of the sea. So the Chinese Coast Guard are acting contrary to the law of the sea. Again, a lot of it is a rules-based order that the Chinese ignore. So I guess holding them accountable that your Coast Guard is supposed to help sailors in distress. I guess those are the rule-based orders that the Chinese Coast Guard is not going to follow. The Chinese did not deny, that they tried to stop the evacuation in both cases. But after the Sierra Madre, they did come up, Chinese Foreign Ministry stated that it would allow vital supplies and evacuation of personnel to the Sierra Madre. So that seems like a sizable concession, and that maybe the Chinese were reacting to the media just looking bad by denying medical services to people in international waters. Again, the West Philippine Seas is part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. It is still allowed to be used for transiting. So, and the Philippines in this case have some jurisdiction that sign agreements with other countries to say, okay, yeah, we'll allow Taiwan fishing rights in this section of the West Philippine Sea. It is theirs to manage. So, but they can't close it to international shipping. So the Chinese Coast Guard was fully within its right to be operating in the area as long as they're not intimidating. Again, that's what they do, along with the Chinese Maritime Militia. But they are supposed to render aid. That's part of the rules-based order. And again, it's the rules-based order that the Chinese ignore. So the Chinese said, okay, we'll allow vital supplies. Now, construction equipment, which is needed on the Sierra Madre because it is rusting and needs work. Construction equipment, which is a hotbed issue for the Chinese, trying to prevent that getting to the Sierra Madre, are not included. Just vital supplies. This is probably food, water, medical supplies. And it would allow the evacuation personnel from the Sierra Madre if the Philippines notified China first. Now, this goes into this part is, this looks like a concession, but it's really not. It's an attempt China to say, hey, we're the reasonable ones. But what you're telling is the Philippines is that they have to ask Chinese permission to operate within their own internationally recognized exclusive economic zone. And also the Sierra Madre is still a Philippine commissioned ship with a crew on it. Now, we all know why they're keeping the crew on there is to keep a presence on that ship. And there's different rules of how you handle a foreign or any country's navy. It's different set of rules. So as long as the Chinese cannot simply board the Sierra Madre without starting an international incident on a naval ship, that is it would basically just come down to an act of war, and it would most likely probably enact the treaty between the defense treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines, and most likely with Japan as well. So that's where this comes into this. That Chinese statement is deceptive because it's requiring the Philippines to ask permission to operate within their own internationally recognized waters. So the other thing is, this one's going long. I apologize. I'll try to go through this. I wrote a little bit more on the Philippines newsletter this week. Philippines and Japan had their 2+2 meeting, which is a meeting between both countries' defense minister, this is their civilian defense ministers, and their foreign ministers. And they did agree to a reciprocal access agreement. This has been in negotiation for quite some time. They had already reached an agreement in understanding that this was going to happen, but they finally finalized it. It's been signed. This will allow both countries to temporarily deploy armed forces on each other's territories on a temporary basis, basically meaning that there's not permanent bases to be established, but just temporary locations for both countries to operate within each other's countries. This is considered a defense against China because it allows, for example, if let's say the Chinese become more aggressive against the Philippines, Palawan Island, what if the Japanese deploy their larger military ships, their larger Coast Guard ships to that area as a temporary measure? So this is something that could be where it is a counter to China and should be thought of as that this is a counter to China. Now, this is one of those things where we go in there is another agreement. So China is constantly talking about all issues within the region, meaning what in this case the South China Sea, is supposed to be handled on a bilateral basis. China and Vietnam and Philippines cannot get together and have a meeting to discuss the issues because China only wants to deal with every country one-on-one where it has the absolute advantage, especially when you look at the smaller countries in the region. Because, again, when you look at militarily and economically, it is the biggest power in the area. Obviously, Japan is very strong and has a sizable GDP, but it is smaller than China. And then, of course, you have the U.S., which operates in the Pacific, but is not necessarily a country of the region, though it does deploy a sizable military deployment in Japan and then rotates through into the Philippines and is very closely aligned with Taiwan, which Taiwan is a country, just to put that out there. So this is obviously a issue that this is the way the Chinese, they want all issues to be handled on bilateral basis, and they ask that they demand that no alliances form within the region. So this 2+2 Japanese Philippine alliance is one of those cases. So this has further eroded the Chinese demands for these bilateral and not having the any type of other alliances or agreements, not if they're not fully alliances, defense agreements, defense cooperation agreements, economic agreement, because China thinks to use this all as something against China. Oftentimes they are, but China kind of deserves it because of how aggressive they are in the region. So countries feel threatened, and the only way they can counter China is to form these agreements to counter China's threat. And China tries to bully countries into not doing that. But it comes into, it's hypocritical in China because China participates in this week, or I guess it was last week, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization they had that meeting. They are a member of BRICS. They are founding members of both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a security, defense, and economic council, mainly of Central Asian nations. BRICS, that's the one where it's forming the mainly the global South countries into forming some kind of counterbalance to the G7. This week, they deployed small military contingent, but a military contingent to Belarus, 40 miles from the NATO border of Poland. So China is okay performing in security alliances and having these other alliances as long as it's them doing it, not as long as their rivals are doing it. So it's very hypocritical of China. Again, these are just where it comes in there is it's just agreement. It's just hypocritical of China when they state this. So this 2+2 agreement has been signed. It still has to be ratified by both legislatures. Doesn't look like there's any real opposition to it. So it will most likely happen. China's their own worst enemy when it comes to this. The other side of it is that there is calls by Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, ordering his military to de-escalate tensions without compromising its sovereign rights. Now, the U.S. has publicly supported the Philippines in its legal claims. It has stated its intention to honor the defense agreement with the Philippines, both to the Philippines, and has made the point very public to China that they have this agreement and that they will honor it with the Philippines if any act comes up that engages that agreement. But the U.S. is also making the point that they want to de-escalate tensions. The U.S. seems to be nervous that what's going on in the West Philippine Sea can spiral out of control and create a war that the U.S. doesn't want to fight. My point of being is this is a war that, maybe the U.S. doesn't want to fight this. That's valid. Maybe it's a war that the Philippines don't want to fight. It's definitely a war the Chinese don't want to fight. This is all the disadvantages of China about force projection. They can go in there and try to intimidate the Philippines by sending ships out there. They can send off their first aircraft carrier, basically an upgraded Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier. It's one thing to be operating those around the Philippines in peacetime. It's very different by operating those ships in wartime outside of Chinese air cover, mainland air cover. This is not a war the Chinese want to fight. And so I'm all for finding a way to de-escalate tensions and finding a way to resolve fairly to the Philippines their international rights within the West Philippine Sea and all other countries in the South China Sea. China is absolutely wrong in the way they do this. They are acting illegally. These claims are ridiculous. Their intimidation is based on illegal matters. This is just not recognized. So de-escalation is a fair way of trying to pursue something, but if it's unilateral de-escalation without any type of response from the Chinese, because again, the Philippines have been trying to de-escalate since June 17th, and what has happened? The Chinese are sending military forces, Coast Guard forces, parking the Monster in the Escoda Shoal, operating an aircraft carrier close to the Philippines, sending 4 destroyers or frigates near the Palawan Island. These are all sources of intimidation. As soon as the Philippines comes up and says, hey, we need to de-escalate, and it's unilateral de-escalation, the Chinese have, so the Philippines pull back, create space between the Philippines and China. And what does China do? They fill that space. They push. That is a gray zone tactic. So, okay, Philippines pulls back because they realize that, the U.S. says, hey, you need to de-escalate this. We want to control. We don't want a war starting. Okay, that's admirable cause. But by being unilateral and the Philippines forced to give space, again, that space is being filled by the Chinese. The Chinese have sent more ships operating in the area because they see de-escalation as a weakness. They see that they have the upper hand in this. And that's wrong. Where it's supposed to be, yes, seek de-escalation, but do it on a bilateral agreement where both sides are agreed to pull back. Not just, hey, we're going to pull back on the hope that we are avoiding a war. That is the projection of weakness. And this is not original thought. I heard this on China Uncensored. Definitely a good show to watch. Humorous, short videos, great to watch. But they talked about the host, Chris Chappell, of course, he has writers, so got to give them credit as well. He talked about these U.S. calls for de-escalation, or this wish-washy message where they say the U.S. says, okay, we have these defense pacts with Japan and the Philippines, we have these pacts with them, but we also want de-escalation. This has put Japan and the Philippines in an odd position because they don't know what exactly is the U.S. wanting from them. That, okay, they go in there and say, hey, we're going to try to defend our sovereign rights. The Chinese react. So what does the U.S. say? Don't escalate. De-escalate the situation. So they pull back. So it's like, but we're operating as before. We're operating within an international order, which you sit there and say, the U.S. says, okay, that is international waters. That's international law. We're all supportive of freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, a rules-based order in maritime shipping. So the Philippines go forward to say, okay, we got the U.S. support, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take actions to defend our sovereign rights. And what does the U.S. say? No, okay, de-escalate the situation. But, okay, say that you support all these things, freedom of navigation, rule-based order, freedom of the seas for maritime trade. But then when they try to push their position, the Philippines, the U.S. and Japan's in this area too, Japan and the Philippines try to push their position, the U.S. tells them to pull back. So they're unsure about where this line is for them. And so as they give space because they don't want to antagonize the Americans, and they're saying, okay, well, you pushed a war that we told you not to do. And again, China will not attack the Philippines because that outward attack would definitely lead to the U.S. defending the Philippines. And the U.S. would do that. They would do that with Japan as well. But how far can China push that line? These calls for unilateral de-escalation, when these countries are pushing for rights of international rights that the U.S. says it supports, but then when they push to China, they are told to de-escalate. And again, that space gets filled. It's, again, call it moving the Overton window, is that space gets filled and it puts China in a stronger position and it puts Philippines and Japan in a weaker position, and they do not know where that line is. So if there's continued calls, because you de-escalate, China fills that gap through unilateral de-escalation. You de-escalate, you give space to try to avoid some conflict. China fills the space by sending in ships and planes and doing all these other activities, sending their Chinese Coast Guard pirates, on ships, then they've just basically filled the space. They've actually increased it. You've made it more unstable. And so what's going to happen now? Are you going to stand their ground, or are you going to say, okay, if it gets bad again, we're going to tell you to de-escalate again? It cannot be unilateral de-escalation, because, again, that is a gray zone tactic that the Chinese and many communist revolutionary societies really embrace. So that's a mistake. And I hope it doesn't get to a point that it's going to continue to put Philippines and Japan in a questionable position. Don't think it will, but that's the danger when you have unilateral escalation or de-escalation requests and not actually put any type of negotiations with China. So it seems like a very immature way of handling international affairs. I know with wars going on in Gaza and Ukraine, U.S. position maybe is like, well, we don't want another war. Get it, but Anthony Blinken can make a trip out to the Western Pacific and make a point of the U.S.'s position again, because this is a war that the Chinese don't want either, and they're probably more so. I've said it before: is if China wants to take on the Philippines, they basically lose their ability to take Taiwan. It's just they would be weakened. Let's say even if they won, their Navy would be so weakened that it would not be able to project an operation on Taiwan. And it cannot take Taiwan and project force to the Philippines and win both. It has to pick one or the other. And I would say that Taiwan is probably the more important stake for them. It's closer to their mainland. It's within their air cover. This is the area for the greatest potential success if you and take out Taiwanese resistance, which would be significant, you would think. Just from a military logistical point of view, the easier projection operation is in Taiwan and not the Philippines. Philippines is an operation that would be an advantage or would be easier for China to take if they can break into the first island chain. That means they have to get the Taiwan will give them breaking into that first island chain. So again, not a world war that the Chinese want, not a war that the U.S. wants, but the U.S. needs to realize that they can press the Chinese. They can allow the Philippines and the Japanese, with full U.S. support, to press the Chinese and make it uncomfortable with them, and at least hope they reach some type of equilibrium where they're not pressing with each other. So again, unilateral de-escalation only leads to other problems. So I've taken almost 2 hours. It's been the longest podcast yet. I apologize. I hope all of you learned something from it. I always get interested in these topics, so I can just talk a long time. I wrote a little bit longer on all these topics this week. Not that it helped. I've lost more followers. So I'm going to try to start reconsidering how I approach writing. I've got a lot of the Russia-Ukraine war, the Orban taking a bully pulpit. Oh, wow. I got some commentary from X on YouTube. Even got to the point they were deleting I guess X was deleting the comments, or they broke terms of service and they got suspended. Anyway, I don't know exactly what happened, but boy, there was some commentary on that one. One of those cases, if you don't make the Russians absolutely happy, and if you don't make the Russian supporters absolutely happy, or if you don't make the Ukraine supporters absolutely happy, the hate will be coming your way. So, and another one, I guess I lost a follower, or a subscriber, not a follower, is over, I guess my statement over the Gaza war, in that I theoretically understand the idea of a Palestinian state, but I don't agree with a Palestinian state at this point because they've got no, basically it comes down to, you should look at the populations of the Palestinians, is that they basically have rejected Israel's right to exist. That has to be resolved. Obviously, it can't continue like it is. It's not good for the Israelis. It's not good for the Palestinians. It's not good for Middle East stability. That needs to be resolved. But this unilateral declaration of Palestinian statehood is the wrong answer, in my opinion. It's just going to lead for further problems, further destabilization. But there needs to be serious talks. And there were at one point, I think it's Ehud Barak, offered Yasser Arafat everything he possibly wanted and more, and Yasser Arafat rejected it because, not just my opinion, Yasser Arafat needed the struggle. That's what maintained his power. It's easier to be in opposition than it is to be governing. Makes you question, how much does that play in the role of the Palestinian peace efforts? So also, I just don't write a lot about it because there's a lot of people that really know the region. There's a lot to be written about there that I don't feel like I have a lot to contribute there. But apparently I made this person upset enough that they went ahead and called it off. Also, I've seen some of my work appearing in other articles, uncredited. That's okay in one way because, hey, I write about current events. We all write on different flavors of the same thing. So sometimes I say that it doesn't seem like there's really an original thought out there. It's just how you originally present an old thought. So that plays into it. So I might have to reconsider because I'm just not getting a lot of subscribers on Substack. I'm not getting a lot on monetization on Rumble is very little. Monetization doesn't even exist on YouTube because you have to get this ridiculous amount of views to get there. So if you're willing to support my content, that would be great. Become a subscriber, a follower. Again, it's a numbers game because you have to have those numbers and followers to give you a sense of legitimacy. I talk about these problems about reconsidering some of what I'm doing. It's not going to change the writing. I'm still going to be creating videos. I'm still going to be great writing. I'm still going to be doing all that. I just might just look at how do I market the strategy? How do I start pursuing more followers, more subscribers? How can I do better at protecting intellectual property rights? So still here for me, still going to be writing. Nothing's changing this week. I don't see anything changing at all through the summer. Just things that I'd need to consider to try to get the word out there and get into a stronger position. But all of you that have become subscribers and followers and support me, it is greatly appreciated. Send out forward work, anything to forward to your friends or colleagues. That always helps as well. I'm sorry I produce so much work. I find that I have to create so many different ways to reach audiences, to try to bring them back to Substack to read the articles and watch the videos. But I don't create anything that's not exclusive to Substack. So everything derives out of Substack. So even if I create a video that's just meant for Rumble and YouTube, I'm going to make sure that is on Substack as well, because there will be no content that that's exclusive that will not be on Substack. So I could have an exclusivity with maybe something that's only on Rumble or something that's only on YouTube, or it will be on Rumble but not YouTube, or vice versa, or it'll be on locals and not either one. There will never be a situation where there will be anything that's not on Substack. So Substack is where everything sources from. So again, please consider subscribing, becoming a follower. That'd be greatly appreciated. I hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for listening to this 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 8-second long podcast. I greatly appreciate it. I hope all of you have a great day and a safe week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.